Don't worry, we're gonna be just...
Structure holds up.
In the quiet confines of a trailer parked on the outskirts of Burbank Airport, Brandon jolts awake, his breath hitching as the remnants of a terrifying nightmare cling to his mind. He vividly remembers a woman struggling beneath the surface of dark, suffocating water, her desperate movements swallowed by an endless abyss. Glancing at the digital clock on his bedside table, he realizes he is dangerously behind schedule. Elsewhere in the terminal, a young man named Jed waits impatiently with his friend Kyle. The two are preparing for a relaxing vacation in Cabo, but the atmosphere is slightly tense as they wait for Jed's girlfriend, Ava. When she arrives, she delivers news that immediately dampens the boys' spirits. Her father, a high-ranking governor, has insisted that Brandon accompany them. Jed dismisses the need for a bodyguard, arguing that a five-star resort is perfectly safe, but his complaints are silenced when Ava receives a call from her father, reminding her of the shadow her political status casts. Kyle begins to tease Brandon about his stoic demeanor. Brandon remains unfazed, explaining that any mundane situation can shift into a lethal threat instantly. To prove his point, he begins a rapid-fire analysis of the people passing through the airport, detailing potential risks and observations that leave Kyle genuinely impressed. As the group moves toward the boarding gates, the reality of Ava's life becomes apparent when an airport employee recognizes her. In another section of the airport, an elderly couple, Marty and Hank, navigate the luggage carousels with their young granddaughter Rosa. The little girl clutches her backpack, which holds her most prized possession, a well-worn teddy bear. Marty informs her husband and granddaughter that she needs to handle an urgent matter and will meet them at the gate. Left alone with his granddaughter, Hank begins to recount various stories from his time in the military. Rosa is so captivated by her grandfather's tales that she fails to notice her teddy bear slipping from her backpack and falling onto the cold airport floor. Nearby, Jed and Kyle continue to pester Ava with questions about her career, their relentless teasing eventually wearing her thin. Irritated, she walks away from them. At the same moment, Rosa realizes her toy is missing and begins to panic, sprinting back through the crowd. In her haste, she collides with Ava, sending hot coffee splashing across the woman's expensive jacket. In a flash of frustration, Ava scolds the child harshly, causing Rosa to flee back to her grandfather in tears. However, the sting of guilt replaces Ava's anger. When she spots the abandoned teddy bear on the floor, she picks it up and returns it. The sight of Rosa's tearful face lighting up with joy softens Ava's mood as they prepare to board. Once inside the aircraft, Danilo, a friendly flight attendant, makes a point to welcome Rosa, telling her that her teddy bear is about to embark on a great adventure. As Ava moves toward the economy section, Brandon reminds her that their tickets are for a higher class, but Ava insists on sitting with her friends. Brandon relents and takes his seat nearby, enduring more of Kyle's jokes. As the plane begins its taxi, the crew performs standard safety demonstrations. Kyle mocks Danilo's movements and begins to whisper about the plane's supposed technical flaws, suggesting that the lack of passengers is a sign of mechanical doom. Jed tries to rationalize the situation, explaining the empty cabin is due to the unpopular travel time, but a sudden jolt of turbulence cuts him off. While Rosa eats candy provided by her grandparents, Marty looks out the window and notices a flock of birds being sucked into one of the engines. The aircraft shudders violently for several seconds, but the pilots manage to stabilize the plane. Danilo moves through the cabin, offering reassurances to the passengers. However, the peace is shattered when Rosa looks out her window and gasps in horror as she sees the turbine engulfed in a terrifying ball of fire. The flight deck descends into chaos as the pilots realize the engine failure is catastrophic. They issue an urgent command for all passengers to brace and summon the cabin crew for instructions. Without warning, a massive piece of the destroyed turbine is hurled back, slamming into the fuselage. The metal skin of the plane tears open, creating a gaping hole that causes an instantaneous and violent decompression. The cabin is filled with a deafening roar as the atmosphere is sucked out, and passengers who aren't securely fastened are yanked from their seats and hurled into the freezing sky. The structural integrity of the aircraft fails completely, and it begins to break apart in midair. People scream and claw at anything they can hold, but the sheer force of the wind and the angle of the descent make survival nearly impossible. With a bone-jarring impact, the remains of the plane slam into the surface of the ocean. The force of the water entering the cabin is lethal, and many who survived the initial breakup are killed instantly by shifting seats and debris. Brandon is pinned by a jagged piece of metal that pierces through his chest. When the motion finally stops, Ava opens her eyes to a nightmare. She sees Kyle nearby, clutching the bloody stump where his arm was torn away. The plane begins to sink rapidly, eventually coming to a rest hundreds of meters below the surface, wedged precariously against an underwater rock formation. The silence of the deep is broken by Danilo emerging from the crew cabin. A series of noises reveals that Brandon, despite his horrific injury, has managed to save both Rosa and Marty. The security guard reaches up and pulls the metal shard from his own chest in a grim display of toughness. Danilo works quickly to revive Marty, who had lost consciousness. As Rosa looks around the cramped, water-filled space, she begins to cry out for her grandfather, but Brandon has to deliver the news that Hank did not survive. To prevent a total collapse of morale, Brandon takes charge, ordering everyone to stay calm and instructing Danilo to inspect the structural integrity. He explains they are currently trapped in a large air pocket. Danilo confirms the pilot sent out a distress signal, meaning a rescue operation is likely underway, but the situation is dire. Oxygen levels are plummeting. Upon checking the emergency tanks, Danilo discovers they are empty. Marty mentions that another passenger had been carrying a portable oxygen cylinder, and Brandon decides he must retrieve it. Before he dives into the flooded corridors, Marty asks him to find her husband's military cap. Brandon gives her a solemn nod and disappears into the dark water. Brandon swims through the drowned remains of the aircraft, navigating through floating luggage and bodies. He finds the oxygen tank and the cap, but as he prepares to return, he is unaware that he is being hunted. A massive shark strikes with lightning speed. The predator's jaws clamp down on Brandon's midsection in a brutal display of power. Despite the fatal nature of the attack, Brandon manages to breach the surface of the air pocket one last time. He hands the retrieved items to a horrified Ava and tells her she must now lead the group and survive on her own. Before she can even process his words, the shark returns, dragging his body back down into the depths. The survivors retreat into the small confines of the crew cabin. Marty, drawing on her past life as a military paramedic, takes command of the medical situation. She uses a magazine to create a makeshift splint for Kyle's shattered arm, expertly resetting the bone, while the young man screams in agony. Outside the thin aluminum walls of the plane, the water begins to take on a sickening red hue as sharks begin to scavenge the remains of the other passengers. Ava tries to comfort the traumatized Rosa by telling her that helicopters are surely overhead, but the reality is that the search teams are struggling to find any trace of the aircraft in the vast ocean. Analyzing the rising water, Ava estimates they have less than 4 hours before the cabin is completely flooded. Jed, however, is more pessimistic, noting that the plane was never designed to withstand the crushing pressure of the deep. As if on cue, the plane shifts again, sliding further down the rocky incline and stopping perilously close to the edge of a massive underwater abyss. Ava proposes a desperate plan. They must swim for the exit hole and try to reach the surface. Jed points out the obvious threat of the sharks, but Rosa remembers a detail from a book mentioning that sharks are often deterred by bubbles. Kyle dismisses the child's idea, but he recalls that 2 professional divers had checked their gear onto the flight. He suggests they find the diving tanks in the luggage compartment. Danilo warns that checked tanks are usually emptied for safety, but Ava insists they might still find suits or masks. While the men search, Ava slips into the bathroom, finally allowing her composure to break. Jed and Kyle eventually find a pair of goggles, but in their frantic state, they accidentally break them. Above the waves, a military helicopter spots floating wreckage, and the commander orders a team of divers to investigate. The divers descend and find the plane, their lights flickering through the windows. Inside, the survivors are ecstatic, believing rescue has arrived. However, the joy is short-lived. As one diver approaches the breach in the hull, a shark emerges from the shadows and devours him instantly, leaving the survivors to watch in horror. The loss of the diver forces the remaining search teams to retreat. Knowing the military diver's equipment might still be near the hole, Ava convinces Jed to help her retrieve an oxygen tank from the fallen soldier. During the attempt, Jed slips into the water and is immediately targeted by a shark. The creature bites down on his leg, and though Ava and Danilo manage to pull him back, the damage is catastrophic. His leg has been severed below the knee. Marty acts quickly to apply a tourniquet, but Jed is inconsolable as he realizes his life as an athlete is over. Determined to find a way out, Ava swims into the flooded baggage hold herself. She encounters an octopus hiding among the suitcases, but manages to find a diving bag containing equipment for 4 people. When she returns, Kyle points out the cruel math. With Jed's worsening condition and the limited gear, they can't take everyone. Ava begs Jed to hold on, promising him a future trip to Alaska, but she soon realizes he has succumbed to his injuries. The weight of his death nearly breaks her. The plane groans and shifts again, the cockpit shearing off and tumbling into the abyss. With the water rising faster than ever, Ava realizes they have no choice but to leave immediately. They plan to use their life vests to create a wall of bubbles to ward off the sharks, just as Rosa suggested. Kyle, paralyzed by a childhood memory of nearly drowning, initially refuses to go. Ava manages to convince him by pointing out that he has survived a long time underwater before and can do it again. As they prepare to submerge, Marty pulls Ava aside and makes a heartbreaking request. She knows she is too weak to make the swim and will only slow them down. She asks Ava to protect Rosa at all costs. Ava reluctantly agrees, and Marty says a final tearful goodbye to her granddaughter, telling her that her grandfather is waiting to protect her. As the cabin begins to disintegrate, the group dives. Marty stays behind in the air pocket, finding peace as the water closes over her. In the chaos of the swim, Kyle's nerves fail him, and he tries to turn back toward the plane. The movement attracts the sharks, and he is killed in seconds. Ava and Danilo continue on, sharing a single oxygen tank, while Rosa uses the other. As they trigger their life vests to begin their ascent, a shark lunges at Ava, but it is distracted at the last moment by Kyle's remains. The sinking plane creates a powerful downdraft, nearly pulling Ava into the abyss, but she manages to break free. She loses consciousness from the lack of oxygen just as she nears the surface. Moments later, she wakes up bobbing in the waves. She spots Rosa's teddy bear floating nearby and fears the worst, but a rescue helicopter soon appears, revealing that Danilo and Rosa have already been pulled to safety. As they are airlifted away, Rosa mourns her grandparents but finds comfort when Ava returns her teddy bear. The survivors sit in the helicopter, exhausted and haunted, as they leave the site of the tragedy behind.